Shading and look dev in Seneferu's procedural pipeline. The shading and look development in Seneferu pipeline is proposed to go as using a shader library for the whole project. The way that a shader of specific type will be assigned to all the objects of this type, and the texture will be resolved in render time based on the texture that is published for each asset. In other words, by let's say that you assigned a layer shader to all the layer objects in the whole scene, then each one of these objects will have the same shader but different textures that will be assigned just in render time. These textures will be coming from the folder where the asset textures goes, and according to the object name per each asset. To understand this more, let's open one of the shaders that ships with Seneferu. Let's take a look, for example, on leather shader. Because it's approved, will not appear through the smart list. You need to say find enclosed. Then we will check out this asset here, and let's go to let's graph this and see how the shader looks like. If you notice here, you will find that the shader has some texture maps connected to some of the shading components, not all of them. What we do is that you can tweak the shader parameters as you want, then you can attach textures to them, to the shading components you are expecting that this type of material will have, like diffuse, specular, subsurface scattering, or whatever the shading components you are expecting that such shader should always have. The other parameters that you are not interested to, or you don't think that you will need to attach textures to them during the production, you can just keep them as they are on the default values, or on the default tweaked values without attaching shaders to them, textures to them. The way the method that I was explaining can be achieved, that is that we are using texture expressions in the file path. This texture expression is looking for the texture dir attribute on the shape that is being rendered, and the shading component, which is diffuse, specular, subsurface scattering, or whatever the shading component is. So what happens is that in render time, all the objects that is having the layer shader will take the diffuse texture, for example, according to the object name from the texture folder belonging to the asset being rendered. So let's better have a look at an actual production example, so you can understand more what do I mean, in case if you are not familiar with this method of shading and look dev. So let's take, for example, or let's texture together this asset here. Set the task to current, set your task to in progress, then load dependencies. This will load for you everything you need to do your job, the reference of how the texture needs to look like. And here we go. The first thing you have to do is to describe the materials of your asset. So I will tell that this is wood, and I will tag it as wood, and I will say that this is metal. I will tag it as metal. Okay, I think that I have these tagged already when I published this. Yes, they are tagged. In this case, when you click on the shader resolve here, I will resolve the whole scene. This will automatically assign the shaders from the library according to the tags that we had. So you will find that this is metal and this is wood and so on. If there are other assets in the scene, it will be resolved also. The system works the way that the shaders are resolved based on the tags that we put on the objects here. So you will notice that this is the matte tag of the ground is generic shader, the matte tag or the material tag of this is metal, as we have just did it. If you have published a texture already for this asset, then Seneferu doesn't look at the tags on the objects. Instead, he looks on the tags information found in the lookdev task that you made and published. So what Seneferu is going to do, he will look first on the if there is any approved lookdev task for this asset. If found a lookdev task that is approved, he will look the shader based on the information found in the lookdev. If he didn't found something in the lookdev, he will resolve the shader based on the information found in a published and approved texturing task. If he didn't found, he will resolve the shader based on what you have tagged here in the scene as how you saw now, because this is a new asset that didn't have any texture or lookdev published before. So if you look at how this looks like, you will notice that the shader is by default going to give you relatively good or relatively good result that you can use for objects or background objects even without textures, just by applying some solid color. So this is now actually the shaders without applying any textures on the asset. What we are going to do is we will start now applying some textures on the asset by assigning direct textures to the shading components that we are interested about. In this case, let's assign a texture to the diffuse map. By the way, it's not an actual diffuse, but what's happening is that this map is going through a network to do a lot of things. So it's not just a straightforward diffuse. So I will assign some textures to these nodes, and I will resume the recording again. Now this is the asset after I applied some textures to the objects, and you can, for example, look at the metal shader. You will find that I assigned here direct texture assignment to some of the objects. If you have any object that needs different texture, you can duplicate the shading network and assign different texture and assign the shader to the object manually in this case, because you are going to duplicate the shading network. Once you are fine with this, maybe you can publish some play blast from the shot camera. Let's refresh that. When you open the Play Blast tool that comes with Seneferu, you will find that this information, you can of course change this logo to whatever, and you can put in the config file where you want it to be, if it should be on the view or not. So where is the... And you can generate a Play Blast here for reviewing, and when you are fine with that, and when you finish, you can now publish your asset. The way how we publish the asset is that we select this and create asset locator, and we will close the Play Blast. And now you are ready to publish that. I will not make a snapshot now. I will just publish it. Okay, now the asset is published. Remember to drag and drop any additional files you have to the published version. For example, if you have any Mari archives or you have any Substance projects or whatever, any project you use to do the texture, PSD files or whatever, what you have to do is to drag and drop them, like to append to this. Append to this means append the files to this version, which is the one that you have published before. The files will be moved to the texture. No need to duplicate the files again. And you can also click Control and have a snapshot to have a better image to your task here. Then what the supervisor will see when he supervises the task, if he opened the task to review the result you have, he will click on click on that. Then this will open the preview image that this is, by the way, not the image, not the snapshot that you made, but the image that I dragged and dropped to the file. If there are Play Blast also, you can drag and drop it to the same version, the same way. In that case, this Play Blast will be played, or turntable, I mean. Then it will be played, so the director or art director or whoever can start giving comments or approving the task. In this case, I will just approve. I will make both the final approval after the art approval. If I loaded one of the assets that was having textures published to it, like this one, for example, if I do load dependencies for the texture, notice that I'm loading the dependencies of the texture, not the textures. So I'm loading the model CHR, which is actually a model that doesn't have any textures in this case. So when I open the shader resolve now, I will resolve all the shaders for the whole scene. Then you will notice that now we have the skin shader assigned to the object. If you look at the reference editor, you will notice that there are multiple or the shaders that were used for this character are loaded. For example, this is the skin shader, which is the current version of the skin shader. The current version means the approved version of the shader, and some other shaders assigned to the rest of the character. If you look at any of the shading components of this shader, you will notice that it doesn't have any textures that is assigned directly to it. But this expression is going to be resolved in render time based on the object attributes that is found here. If you notice that this texture diar is telling the system where is the textures are published for this asset. So if I rendered this scene now, let's take a better light first. And maybe we don't need to see this in the viewport. Then let's render that. Then you will notice now that all the objects are already having textures assigned to them. While actually none of them is having any texture that is referenced in any of the shading component. These are coming in render time. This way, for example, this skin shader will be applied to all the characters in the scene, while each one or every one of the characters will be having his own textures based on what was published in the texturing and lookdev tasks, while the shader itself or the shading network itself will always be the same shader. So whenever you improve and refine this shader in the library and you publish a new updated version that produces better or more refined result, this will be applied on all your assets, and this way you will have consistent look and feel for all your assets through the whole show. And any objects that were or any shots that were rendered before will be marked to as revisit or needs double checking, and you will get notified by the production manager about them. I mean the Seneferu production manager. He will notify you that these lighting recipes needs to be revisited or double checked because one of the shaders or the texture of one of the assets being used in that lighting recipe has been updated. So you have to double check if you are fine with this, or you will have to re-render the shot again to maintain the look and feel after such update. This is for using shader library concept. And there is another concept where you can use it more for characters, like if you need to make a collection of shaders that is developed and refined and specifically for a specific character. In that case, you can use look files instead of the shader library itself. The look files are the same concept exactly, but the difference is that the look file is a collection of shaders that you tweak specifically for one particular character, and you publish this look file for this character. So whenever this character is loaded in any scene, you can apply the look of the character by clicking on the resolve looks. The resolve looks will go through all the scene. Any asset that has specific look or collection of shaders, these collection of shaders will be loaded and applied to the character, and as the same as I was explaining now, the textures for each one of these shaders will be assigned in render time, not in the scene itself. This way you can have multiple look files for the assets that you are very picky about them. you can just look dev them and generate a look file for them. So in addition to the shader library that ships with Seneferu, which is most of the time will give you good results without even assigning texture in a lot of scenarios, I would like to show you now how to build such shading network that have this kind of correlations to the asset tags and the expressions on the textures, the way that you can take advantage from the way that Seneferu is resolving the shaders and textures either in Maya or in Katana. So I will go quickly through the way how you can build such shading network. I will create a new scene. Let's say that we are assigned here to work in a shader called whatever. Let's have this shader again as an example. This time I'm not going to check it out. Instead, I will work on an empty scene. First thing I will do, I will create the surface shader or Arnold standard shader. It doesn't matter, depending on what you want. And now let's think about what are the shading components that we are expecting that we will need texture maps for them in general. So let's assume now that we will need the diffuse color and we will need the specular edge color. And because I will set this to physical, then the specular will be the edge color. And let's say that we also want the normals. Bump normal. I didn't click control, sorry. And let's say we said we want diffuse. That's enough for now. And when I click on this button here, this will generate or will create this shading networks, and this shading network and connect it to the shading components that I choose here. And you will notice that it's now having the expression of the texture path, and it has the default color have been set based on the default color that was here. So in other words, what you can do is to of course you will be having lights and test objects to develop and make a shader. Then you will test that shader and you will start tweaking the parameters of this shader, and when you are satisfied with the values that you want, then when you click on, for example, I modified this now to 0.45. If I now created a shading network for the specular roughness using the same method, this time I will use this button. This button doesn't create manifold or texture placement nodes. So you will notice now that the default color now is 0.45. So this means that if I didn't provide a texture to the specular roughness, this default color will be used. If I provided a texture Not, of course, I don't mean a texture here, but I mean a texture that is published in the texture folder of this asset. If there is no specular roughness texture published in the texture folder of this asset, then the default color, of this shading texture will be used. If there is a texture found there, then the texture will be found and the default color here will be ignored. So when we update this shader with a different default color, if you have already published the texture for that, then this object will not be affected when you re-render any lighting shot that has this object, but only the objects that didn't have specular roughness texture will be affected by the new shader. This way, your assets that have textures published already will not get affected by any shading components has been changed in a new version of the shader. If the new version of the shader didn't modify any of the shading components that doesn't have texture maps on these assets. Anyway, I don't want to get you confused. Just think about it like it's a shader library where one shader is assigned to all the objects of the same type, and the texture for each object will be resolved in render time based on the texture that you have published for this asset. Diffuse map, bump map, displacement, whatever you have published for it, it will be available. Another thing I can also show here regarding to this is how to build a displacement shading network. It's the same concept. Just click on this and click on the displace button. This will generate the displacement shading network. It's also having references, and this shading network now supports any type of texture you applied. If it's a texture, if it's a vector displacement map, you will assign it to the vector displacement texture socket, or if it's scalar displacement, you will assign it here. And if it's centered around 0.5, then you can assign a texture here to the displacement offset, which should set this to either 0 or 0.5. By default, it will be 0.5, assuming that normal displacement is centered around 0.5. But if you know that you are using world space displacement, or you are not using centered maps, then you can assign a black texture to this offset, so it becomes 0, then the offset will have no effect. Let's now work on a texturing task and see how do we use these shading networks in production when we are doing the look dev or the textures for assets. Let's take a test character here, this man head texture, and let's work on it. This is a non-asset that you might be aware of, or you might have seen it somewhere on internet, or in Arnold documentation, or even RenderMan documentation. You will find this asset somewhere, and it's good to see it so you can see how the textures are going to look like when you apply it to your shading network here that is developed this way and shipped with Seneferu. The first thing you have to do is to tell Seneferu what type of material this object should have. In our case, this should be skin. And you will click on Set Matte. This tells or tags this object as a skin object, or tells the system that this will be having a skin shader. When you resolve the shader now, what happens during the resolve shader that the shader resolve will look for a texture or look dev that was published for this asset in the system. If the system found that there is a look dev was published, then the shader will be resolved based on the information found in the published look dev. If it didn't find look dev, he will check for texture that was published for this asset before. Then the shader resolve will be done based on the texture that was the texturing information that was published before. For your information, when we published the texture for this character, which is something that I did before, there is a texture tags file here. This is the file that the shader resolve is using to resolve the textures and the shaders for all the objects of this asset whenever a texture task is found. If there is no texture was ever published and there is no look dev was ever published for this asset, then what's going to happen is that the shader resolve will resolve the shaders of the object based on the material tags that you did using this button here. So let's go back again to our task. I want to set it to current because I want the task control to be connected to the production manager. So now let's resolve the shader. As you saw, the resolve has loaded the skin shader and assigned it to the character, but of course now we will not find any textures assigned to the asset because we didn't publish any textures yet. So this is actually the shader as how it was tweaked, and this is the result that the shader will produce without assigning any texture maps. So let's now go to here, and by the way, the shading network shipped with Seneferu, you will find that there is a documentation with each shader on how to use it, because a shader like the skin is having a complex shading network where I developed the shader the way that you can only assign the diffuse map, then everything behaves as expected, and all the subsurface scattering and everything will behave as expected once you assign the diffuse map. So let's do that. I will browse to the texture of this character. We will select the diffuse color, and we can also attach the displacement map. And as you can see that the character now is having the look based on this Let's render using different light, and let's see how it will look like. Yeah, for example, that's it. So this is, as you see, it's all based on the diffuse texture, and as you can see, the skin shader will behave just get the best result. You still have to provide more maps like the subsurface scattering maps and any other maps you think that you might need to have for this. Let me hide this object which is destroying the look. Once you are satisfied with this and it's time to publish the texture that you did, it's good to generate a play blast of your render. Then what you will have to do now after you have finished the publish will ask for an image for review. I will not generate one now. Instead, I will just publish normally. So now, since this character now have published textures, the textures that we published now, then whenever this character is loaded in any assembled scene or any lighting recipe, then when you resolve the shader for the assembled scene, all the characters will be getting shaders based on the look, dev, and texture information. Like in this case, it was a texturing task, then that has information about the shading of this asset, which is in our case, it's a skin shader that, of course, now it doesn't have any textures assigned because we are now resolving it for lighting, or we are resolving the asset in a assembled scene that has all the assets with the shading that has texture, path, and expressions format that will resolve in render time. And of course, after publishing, you have to make sure to generate a preview of your object or your asset that should go to should be published in the task for review purposes and for future reference. So what I will do now is that I will generate a play blast using this tool here, and by looking through the turntable camera that came within the dependencies, Yeah, that's enough for now. And let's generate a play blast that will be okay. After finishing the play blast, what you are going to do is to simply drag and drop the play blast that you created into the task that you published, and make sure that you have extension in the folder name, because the production manager needs to know or to expect what kind of folder is this, or what are the contents types of this folder. It doesn't have to be exact similar to the image texture, but or the images in the folder, but it's just any extension that tells the system that there are pictures inside. So .pic, maybe .preview, .media, whatever. But there must be an extension for the folder. Drag and drop it and say append to this means append to this version, which is the version that we published of the texture. Now, maybe you can also take a snapshot of this by, let's take screen for this guy here. Okay, so now what the supervisor is going to do, or the director, or art director, or whoever, then when he wants to review that, he will shift click on the button. He will see the play blast that you published. If he's satisfied with this, he will art approve it. Then we go for the last approval thing that goes to the supervisor when this is the last thing that we do the technical check and make sure that when we load dependencies of this asset and resolving the shader, that everything looks correct and as expected and nothing is broken. Then in that case we do the final approval. And I can approve this too.